Welcome to Chapter 5, Communication Disorders in a Multicultural World. If you are in the Cultural Diversity class on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 8, you might find that some of the initial slides look familiar, and some of the material covered a little bit later in the lecture will hopefully be new to you. So let's get started. First, with the definition of multicultural, and it describes a society characterized by a diversity of cultures with varieties of religions, languages, customs, traditions, and values. Cultural competence is the ability of professionals to respect, recognize, value, and honor the beliefs and values of the individuals and families they serve, as well as engage in continual self-assessment regarding cultural difference between themselves and their clients. This is something that is developed over time. Your first year in maybe a clinic setting, it might be a little more difficult to see yourself being professional and respecting and recognizing values of others. That's something that you will learn along the way, and something I've learned along the way. It just makes builds the rapport between you and the clients that you'll be serving, to show them that you respect them and value the cultures that they come from. It's also pretty interesting to find out about how other cultures, what other cultures believe, and how their value systems differ from our value systems here in America. Ethnocentrism is the view that members of one's own culture do things the right way. We in America can probably be accused of that pretty fairly. We seem to think sometimes that we are the end-all be-all and it's our way or the highway, not just in the professional world, but in politics, in religion, just to name a few. Sometimes it's looked at as all other ways of doing something are unnatural, inferior, or maybe even barbaric. The even barbaric statement is probably pretty extreme. Cultural relativism is a belief that other ways of doing things are different, yet equally valid. And that's what we would be striving for, is cultural relativism, that we see people from other cultures and their value systems as equally valid as our value systems. African American English, or AAE, as it's abbreviated, is a dialect of standard American English. Mainstream American English might say something like, "It does make sense." And that same statement in African American English might come across as, "It do make sense." There are also references in the book to other changes from mainstream American English to African American English. This is just one example of that. Code switching is something that probably most or all of us do without even really realizing that we're doing it. It involves using different linguistic styles for different situations that we come across. The most obvious one would be a job situation versus a home situation. And that's kind of what this example that's coming up next is. My husband uses a country accent, as my kids call it, when talking with his friends on the phone or in person. And at work in a professional setting, as a salesman, he drops the accent and uses a more professional sounding sales voice. Hispanic culture and linguistic variables that influence service delivery. We're going to be reviewing Hispanic culture and the Asian culture in this chapter. Those are obviously just two of the different cultures. We could go into more depth, but this being an intro course, we're just kind of looking at two of the larger cultures and how and the linguistic variables that influence the service delivery. The terms Hispanic and Latino can be used interchangeably. They both have roots in Spanish, and they encompass people from different cultures, Mexico and Puerto Rico, just to name a couple. Hispanic culture historically has a lot of respect for teachers and teaching institutions. So they may keep their distance when decisions about their child are being made. And this could be construed as them not caring or being aloof, when really they are just looking to professionals and the teachers as the experts. And so they just defer to what the teacher believes is best for the child, even though the teachers are talking about obviously the parent's child. And they may step down and defer to those teachers to make decisions. In America, we tend to maximize our time. We see it as being efficient. Other cultures, like the Hispanic culture, may see it as us being blunt or too brief or too hurried to get down to business. And so as professionals, we may need to pull back the reins a little bit and get down to business a little bit more slowly. In the Hispanic culture, families like to engage in small talk. We might call it small talk, asking about how their day is or how work was, talking about how much we enjoy working with their child, things like that, before we jump into the nitty-gritty of how to provide services for a child. Moving over to the Asian culture. Asians speak several languages. They are very focused on family. They also focus on interdependence versus independence. In America, we want our children to be as independent as possible and to kind of do things and figure things out on their own. In the Asian culture, interdependence is encouraged, where all family members have a role within that family, and oftentimes extended family lives in the same household as a mom and dad and children. And so they kind of work together as a family unit. Sometimes the Asian culture views disabilities as the result of wrongdoing on the part of the individual with the disability and or that individual's ancestors, which is different than how we view disabilities here in America. So we need to make sure that we're sensitive to where they might be coming from as far as the person with the disability. Disabilities incurred later in life, maybe a head trauma from a car accident or a stroke, may be seen as karma, that they did something to deserve that stroke or that TBI to happen, which again is different than what we believe here in America. English language learners. This has had several different names in the past. Some people may have referred to them English as a second language, ESL learners, but the current term is English language learners, or ELLs. They tend to be over-referred for special education services. Oftentimes, these students are at risk for falling behind grade level, and so teachers will refer them for special education services or speech pathology, speech language services, and looking for that child to bridge the gap and have them not fall behind in the regular education classroom. These children may struggle because they come to kindergarten speaking little or no English. because classes are taught only in English in most of America. There are some small pockets where teachers are teaching the material bilingually, but here in our area in North Carolina, we teach English only in the classrooms. ELLs come from environments and cultural backgrounds that are different from that of typical middle-class U.S. public school students, so they struggle with that also. Second language acquisition. ELLs almost always demonstrate errors of transfer. And this means that there are errors in the second language caused by the influence of the first language. And the example here that I put from the book was, I like very much a speech, meaning I like speech very much. Some second language learners go through a silent period where there's little or no talking in the second language. And sometimes they become silent in their first language as well, which, as you can imagine, is probably concerning to parents and teachers, because if children are not talking in the second language and they're silent in their first language, there's not a whole lot of communication going on. During this time, it's thought that children are focusing on the comprehension of the second language as a precursor to producing it. So obviously, if you're focusing on comprehension, you're thinking and processing, so there might not be as much expressive language happening. Children might demonstrate language loss with respect to the first language as the second language becomes dominant. Simultaneous versus sequential bilingual acquisition. This is exactly what it sounds like. Simultaneous acquisition is occurring when two languages are acquired simultaneously from infancy or shortly after. You may know, or you may be a part of a family who decides at birth that mom is going to speak one language and dad is going to speak another language to the child in the home setting, and therefore that child would be acquiring simultaneously. And then sequential is exposure to the first language during infancy and to the second language at home during preschool or kindergarten. Non-biased assessment. Most of you probably are familiar with standardized assessments, and it is recommended that standardized English tests are not to be used with ELLs. These are normed by using children who are speaking English, and children who are learning English as a second language obviously are not going to or shouldn't be compared to those norms. Informal non-standardized assessment measures are recommended instead. Some of those, well, in order to do this, you need to obtain a case history including language milestones. That would be the first thing that you would want to do, pretty extensive case history. If the family speaks English and can write in English, then you could have them do it. If not, you would probably need to do that through an interpreter in your work setting. If a delay is shown in the first language that's learned, this serves as a red flag for a language disorder. Questionnaires can also be helpful. Again, if a family can speak English and write in English, they could do this on their own. If not, then an interpreter or a translator would need to be used to fill out the questionnaire in order for it to be accurate. Observations of a student in their natural environments can be helpful to see if or how the student communicates with peers and adults. This could happen in a classroom setting, could happen in a home setting. Those are probably the two main settings where it would happen with the parent present. So the parent could interpret for the child if necessary. Language samples in both languages to compare to the student's peers in the first language and the second language. So taking a language sample, although it's a little bit time consuming, is a really good way to break down and look at syntax and semantics of the child's language in both languages. Looking at school records to view performance over time. This could be a good piece of the puzzle to look at to see if children have if their performance has decreased over time, to look at why that's happening. As children are further immersed in the English language, obviously those gaps should be closing. If the gap is staying widened, then that might be an indicator that a child has a true language disorder. You can also assess narrative skills in the first language. Sometimes poor narrative skills in the first language are indicators of language disorders. Dynamic assessment is also a way to assess children who are ELLs. This means that you're evaluating a student over time in a teach, then test, then reteach format. You're looking at how well children can learn things when you teach them new information. So you would teach the information and then you would test them on that to see where the areas or what areas they have learned through that initial teaching, and then what areas they didn't learn, and the areas they didn't learn you would reteach. This evaluates the student's ability to learn when they're taught, and it asks when the child is taught, how well does the child learn new information? If they are able to learn new information, then there's probably not a language disorder present. And obviously, if they're not able to learn new information, then you would look at why that is happening. A language disorder can be suspected if the child has difficulty learning, even when given instruction in the first language. So, in order for the instruction to be given in the first language, obviously, if the teacher doesn't speak that first language, then an interpreter would be brought in to help the child with the translation of languages. Another type of evaluation might be of information processing skills. It's a valid method of assessment for ELLs. Again, it's non-standardized. Difficulties with information processing may include short-term verbal memory deficits and difficulty retaining the sequential order of information, meaning they might have difficulty repeating back sentences or lists of digits or nonsense words. And that's it for Chapter 5. Hoping that's pretty short and sweet, and enjoy your break, your day off next Monday, and the discussion questions will be posted on As You Learn. Thanks for listening.